Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm David Schiff. Welcome to the National Security Innovation Network Diversity Unlocks Innovation Speaker Series. This is celebrating Pride Month. Again, I'm David. I'm your moderator today. I'm one of NSIN's at-large regional directors, which means I help NSIN oversee the development of Department of Defense mission partner, academic, and private sector relationships to enable NSIN's mission. That mission is to build networks of innovators to generate new and novel solutions to national security challenges. Today's event is part of a year-long diversity, equity, and inclusion campaign to raise awareness about the critical role of diversity in national security problem solving. We are trying to build a diverse network ourselves at NSIN and across the DoD. That's both to expand and diversify the national security innovation base. And that's not only a priority for our team, it's also one for our chain of command. That was reiterated a couple of weeks back by Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks. So today we're fortunate to have Luke Schleusener, who's the president and co-founder of Out in National Security, as our guest speaker. Mr. Schleusener is a security fellow at the Truman National Security Project. He served on the speechwriting staff of Secretaries of Defense Panetta, Hagel, and Carter from 2012 to 2017. Previous to which he worked in the White House Office of Presidential Personnel. That was from 2011 to 2012, and he was on President Obama's campaign in 2008. He previously served on the board of No One Left Behind, a 501c3 that serves special immigration visa holders. He holds an AM from the University of Chicago and a BA from Wesleyan University. He was a Zemsky Scholar of Arabic at Hebrew University in 2010 and attended the American University of Cairo. So it's a pleasure and an honor to have you here today, Luke, and look forward to speaking with you.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about, how someone with those sort of touchy-feely lefty credentials ended up in the Pentagon, and then broadly speaking, the national security state, and why Out in National Security exists. I'm an odd choice because I am a Quaker, which means I am a registered conscientious objector, and I'm a gay man. I came out to my parents a month after Matthew Shepard got killed when I was 12. It's a great time to learn that there are many people in the United States and around the world who wish you ill, and a much larger number of people who don't care if you live or die. But I was also at that point secretary of my Model United Nations Club, and as I progressed through middle school and high school, thought I wanted to serve the country, which was inflected, like lots of folks, by September 11th. Took a look around, and could not join the military, didn't want to, had a very sharp line, which was, if you under don't ask, don't tell, if you don't want all of me, you're not getting any of me. And so spent the next decade taking a bunch of State Department money to learn Arabic and negotiating with different parts of the IC to go make friends. Instead, as a gag, one of my mother's friends, the old mayor of Chicago, introduced me to Ted Kennedy as a gag at a birthday party. And I got hired first as a junior staffer before coming back from abroad, and then stayed with him through the 2008 campaign when he gave me to Barack Obama. I had thought that I'd be better off staying away from gay rights, but also understood that in an Obama presidency, my community would be advanced by things that would happen at DoD. The end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, other regulations, ship the state is fast, move slow, but if you tilt it, you get everything. The Pentagon by itself is one of the nation's largest, if not the largest, LGBT employer, directly employing 1 in every 100 Americans, 1 in 5 of whom is not heterosexual. So went to the Pentagon, spent thrilling 5 years there, so I know where all the copy paper is and where to get the best snacks. But this also meant that I was there for the arc of personnel reforms, from repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, women in combat, and then as court cases proceeded, Windsor and Obergefell, extending benefits to members of the National Guard, to service members, that sort of thing. The idea for ONS ping-ponged back and forth between myself and now Assistant Secretary for Defense, Sean Skelly, when Secretary Carter decided to repeal the ban on transgender military service. Me, because when you're on the Secretary's staff, you can run around the Pentagon like the maid of honor at a wedding, shout, the Secretary needs this, and get whatever you want. And her, because she was then and still is the highest ranking trans person in the federal government. And we both noticed that there was not a single member of our community at the table. And on the outside, most of traditional big gay advocacy didn't understand the national security state, wasn't going to try. and decided that it was going to focus on what a hero Chelsea Manning was, which was awkward for all of us. I, in fact, had to call over to HRC and tell them to tone it down. And so we had thought, end of the Obama administration, things are going well. We are going to set up some sort of process so that, when Hillary Clinton is president, personnel and readiness and other parts of the Pentagon will be in the hands of people like us or nominal allies who understand our issues. Of course, that didn't happen. So we found new jobs elsewhere, and then came back to this. And we added our co-founder, Mr. Rusty Pickens, who's a two-spirited Native American from Oklahoma, and broadly came up with the idea of ONS, which is meant to recruit, retain, promote queer people in national security, change law, custom, and policy, do a little bit of public education. And the thing that we found the most important, especially in the out years of the Trump administration and during COVID, which is to build community. Because while queer people are everywhere across the national security enterprise, and every office, every organization has an ERG or something like it, they are necessarily sometimes backs against the wall, fighting to just get basic benefits, fighting to have a pride event, fighting for something less terrible than their current work situation. And so we get to be the connective glue for a lot of folks, and we've spent a lot of time and energy giving people access to attorneys, upskilling people for ERGs. And frankly, even in the 21st century, less than half of all LGBTQ employees in the private sector are comfortable being out of the closet at work. Some because they believe in their workplace is too narrow-minded, some because they think it will only be read as sexual in nature as opposed to a basic fact like eye or hair color. And some just because that's attitudinally not how they feel. And also quite often because people will get policed for how they present gender in the workplace by how they're dressed. This means that the country is wasting a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of talent on people who have to look over their shoulder and second guess themselves wherever they are, whether or not it's at Lockheed or at Booz Allen or at the Pentagon. And so that's why ONS exists, to put pressure and stop wasting American talent at a time when it matters that you pull together a diverse team to solve problems, because diverse teams generally make better solutions, frankly. And failures to look out at the world and include everyone is a profoundly bad idea. The nice thing about running this org is that, having been to the Pentagon, knowing where the copy paper is, we have pretty direct conversations with the Deputy Secretary about policy failures and sort of shortcomings that I'm perfectly happy to explore during questions. I could go on for a while and I could talk about lots of other stuff, but I'm going to put a pin in it and hand it over to Q&A.
Well, I was going to ask a couple that I had already had before we started was, what are the biggest misconceptions about the LGBTQ community that you've noticed in the national security space?
One of the most persistent ones is either that everyone has arrived since the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and thus there have not been continuously queer people in national security, and there have been people working for the national security state as long as there's been one for the United States. I can go back to before the revolution and find people. That's one. The other one is that LGBT people are uniquely asking for special rights. So you all may have seen the social media post of the Marine Corps celebrating Pride Month this year, which was a take on the poster for Full Metal Jacket, except for the bullets were painted in rainbow colors. And anytime any service says something positive about a minority, there is a meltdown on the internet. And this one was spectacular because it was many different Marines presuming that when they served anytime after the Korean War, that they didn't serve with any homosexuals, and that this was catering to a special minority. And so one of the things that holds back the department in aggregate and the services is that even though the military and the country are essentially one piece, there are plenty of people in the military, especially in its upper echelon, who don't know they know gay people in the field and tend to be narrow-minded, and that tends to perpetuate all sorts of problems. One of my mentees left the Air Force after a decade in service because his CO told him that beyond becoming a major, he didn't think a man with a same-sex spouse should advance in the Air Force. And that's the kind of grotesque bigotry that's going to be an ongoing problem, probably generationally. And those are sort of the most frequent two. Happy to dig in a little further with you.
I'll hand it to Spencer. He has his hands up.
Sure. Hi, Spencer.
Hi, thanks very much. Really appreciate it. Okay, so yeah, I was
Can you guys hear him? Spencer?
Spencer, you
Sorry,
might wanna-
is that better?
Yeah.
Is that better? Okay.
Yes.
Sorry, got to do this whole thing. Just wanted to pick up a little bit on what you were saying about changes in environment under different administrations. Obviously, there's only a limited track record,
Right.
in the more legally open era. But how dramatic those have been so far, and I would presume you see that moderating somewhat, but as different parties assume the presidency, where you think that's going, and whether there is a trend to spot yet.
I think it's going to get worse rather than better. Obviously, we're going to be carefully nonpartisan here as I lead a nonpartisan nonprofit, but
Sure.
Under the administration of President Trump, not only was there a tremendous amount of backsliding, there was a lot of meticulous targeting. So, for example, the Secretary of the Air Force made a point of hunting down and expelling HIV positive service members, even though if you're on antiretrovirals, you're combat ready, it does not matter. And for example, there are lots of complaints about the chaplaincy corps being used to harass people, and she, in fact, expanded their ability to proselytize, which is not great. Given the current state of backlash out across the country, we're looking at 200 anti-trans bills and about 150 anti-LGBT ones, more broadly speaking, as well as lots of other different weird small acts. There is that infamous Twitter account, Libs of TikTok, which is instigating stochastic terrorism, which isn't great. And I don't think the Pentagon, as currently constituted, is reacting to this appropriately, in the sense that there's now 23 states that have major US military installations and no formal policy to protect 1 in 5, which is, 1 million and change in terms of service, active guard and reserve, let alone your contractors, your civilians, and so on and so forth, vendors, from these laws. So, for example, if you are the parent of a trans child in Texas right now, TRICARE has stopped giving your child hormones because they have no clear guidance.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? The states, right, I guess it hadn't occurred to me until, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but it's a very good point, is that, if you're not in DC, then you're in, you're on federal land in a state, and you might live in one jurisdiction and you work in another jurisdiction, right? So
that's correct. And of course, people say things like, while you're posted to, God help us, anything but joint base Lewis McChord. Like you want to go to Air War College, Maxwell, Alabama, yikes. Where your children can now be taken away if you give them gender confirmation treatments, or if you are seen in a variety of capacities in public as a homosexual of some flavor. Live on base for all 3 years. Are you out of your mind? So I am of the belief, and this is sort of a point I'm having back and forth with different members of the Armed Services Committees and with the Deputy Secretary, that the department should proactively promise to defend people using the JAG Corps against things like it's a felony to cross state lines to get your child necessary medical treatment, or things of that nature. Right now, the department has a soft policy of compassionate reassignment. What I would like the department to do is have a hard one with a clear framework, and much more importantly, one that collects data on, are people not going to Fort Hood because Fort Hood apparently murders tons of service members who are there? Are people avoiding the South? What are the career retribution points? And does the military as a whole, when its most talented members who, obviously this affects LGBT service members, but I have, good friends in uniform who happen to have a trans kid, a gay kid, that sort of thing, a lesbian, or a kid who's non-binary and sort of figuring it out. And all of them are now rerouting all their military careers to parts of the country where it's safe to have that kid in school.
Right.
And that is going to be a gigantic, messy waste of talent over the next couple of years. I am uncertain about how bad it would get next time, but I'm going to assume bad. In part because I've been impressed by the malicious use of bureaucracy to target people you don't like. You may have seen the phrase somewhere, "the cruelty is the point," which is ominous. I've seen sort of far right groups discuss bringing back "Don't Ask, Don't Tell." I'm not sure they could, but there's also a lot of leeway between where we are and how bad it can get.
Yeah.
Which is obviously here to talk about innovation and solutions, but of course, it's important to be aware of even the most morbid realities.
Yeah, and you'd make a good point, to the innovation point about data and and testing. This isn't sort of a this isn't just sort of a 0 and 1. Either it is or it isn't. There's a lot of in terms of policy and and safety and so forth. And so there's a lot of work to be done and data to be gathered and understanding to be shared. So thank you.
Yes, sure. I will also note that right now the department does not collect gender identity or sexual orientation notes. I think this is in some ways great because it means it will not end up in the hands of someone who wants to go harass all those people. On the other hand, it hampers my ability to help to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
So that is another question about data and innovation and resilience. But let's go to the next question.
Yeah, thanks for that.
So, Luke, the DoD is taking a lot of action to advance the interests of LGBTQ members, both civilian and military. Deputy Secretary Hicks had listed a bunch of those, but said we know there's a lot more work to be done. You've kind of touched on this a little bit. I'd like to know more about what else must be done to make things better, and how can we help?
Okay, I mean, there's always more work to do. It's again, it employs the most Americans, et cetera, et cetera. Looking backwards, DoD, like the State Department, needs a thing called the Love Act. Love Act is a bill that makes state go back and look at its behavior from the 1940s through the 1990s, when there was a bar on LGBTQ people holding security clearances. And that ranged from 47 to 1998. So, from basically Casablanca to, the new Brady Bunch movie, which is a long stretch of time. Same thing happened to the US military. In fact, contractors who worked in tech were the people who were most likely to sue. So between 1970 and 1994, 4 different LGBT groups who worked at the cutting edge of tech sued the federal government, ultimately lost. The most famous being Supreme Court near and dear to my case near and dear to my heart, which is high tech gays versus disco. For the name alone, the only time the gays have been against disco. And so there's this vast stretch of people, civilians, service members, contractors, whose lives got ruined, who got hunted down and kicked out for being queer, and quite often drank themselves into an early grave or otherwise could not find employment. And right now, post don't ask, don't tell. If you're a service member, for example, you can case by case get your discharge updated, but you can't get your medals back if your medals were stripped. We should borrow from our partners and allies who are a little bit more nimble. Canada and England have both made deals so that if you're prior service, as a class, at least for uniformed service members, you can get an automatic upgrade to your discharge, which in many cases for us would mean access to benefits and access to the VA. And you could also get your medals back, which is a big deal. Canada uniquely has also opted for a gigantic fund called the LGBT Purge Fund, which is meant to find and pay back everyone the government harassed and whose lives they ruined. And much more importantly, has made the government apologize and build a museum to the bad things they did. So that is retroactive to before. Going forward, it's a constellation of things. There is, as yet, no black letter law for transgender military service. There's no black letter law for non-binary service, which is coming up. I am a full-time sponsor of the LGBT Club at the U.S. Naval Academy. Their entire leadership is non-binary. I'm very proud of those kids. I'm very happy for those kids. The Navy happens to be on good terms with all of them in terms of their psychiatric and medical needs, but there's no formal policy or means to protect them. And as those numbers tick upwards, the military both has to be ready and has to anticipate that those service members are going to be uniquely harassed for who they are, despite their qualifications to serve the country. The Naval Academy, for example, hugely selective. They're bright kids. They're going to graduate near the top of their class, and it would be a waste to get rid of them because you're going to blow $500,000 educating them and then kick them out is dumb. So those are sort of top line things. Somewhat secondarily, TRICARE right now is under no obligation to train its care providers in LGBT care. The VA does this. TRICARE should. So that, for example, if you're a young gay man and you go to your annual physical for TRICARE and you explain, you get taped the whole thing so you can stay in the military, and they ask you about medications you're on, one complaint I have gotten often is if you're on PrEP, you are assumed to be HIV positive, as opposed to preventing becoming HIV positive and seroconverting. But on and on, the constellation of things that families are going to need as more and more same-sex families proceed through the US military and rise up the ranks, if we're going to retain anybody, and the benefits that people are going to need when they have queer kids. My friend who has a non-binary kid was lucky enough that Walter Reed will actually offer therapy and eventually puberty blockers and confirmation surgery, but that's not a uniform policy or practice. And if you're going to retain 1 in 5 Americans who participate in the military at a much higher rate, trans people, 1 in 5 trans Americans will serve in the military at some point in their lives, and 1 in 4 LGBT, gay, bisexual, and lesbian folks will as well. So that is wildly outperforming straight Americans. And at a time when 7 out of 10 Americans can't put on a uniform and get in the game, it's a dumb waste. And so that is a rubric of what to do for service members. Similar policy changes need to be made for civilians. Beyond this, I would say that while military equal opportunity, for example, incorporates sexual orientation and gender identity, I would want it to incorporate the recent Supreme Court decision, Bostick v. Clayton County, which pulls it under the Civil Rights Act. And I would like to see military EO stop being so toothless and go on the offensive. More oversight, more downward pressure. The biggest challenge is going to be, as the political pendulum swings and pressure changes, pressure both from the top of the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs and below, so that you don't have what's happened in some cases where a sailor or a Marine or an airman happens to be on their local pride committee and their promotion stops because the person reviewing their packet is a bigot, because that's a waste of talent. In terms of what NSIN can do, obviously pull more queer people in, but also advocate for the people you have. The most important thing to do if you are a straight person and you care about this is to be the first person to call and heckle HR. It is an additional tax on any minority if they have to go and explain themselves or go through the grievance process without support. And so creating a cultural pattern that, for example, converges with Lockheed standards. Lockheed spent the last decade becoming trans friendly and has done reasonably well. So that's one place to go in terms of what you can do as an ally. And the other thing is, of course, not only hire these people, but mentor them and plug into the communities that we've already set up, particularly in technology. I have sibling organizations, one called OSTEM, which is out in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Lesbians Who Tech is a huge one, and they have my favorite thing in the world, which is a memorial scholarship fund to Edie Windsor, who was an IBM computer programmer and then executive for a long time, as well as being the person who forced marriage equality forward. And there's just other ways to help. Just be involved and be a good ally. It's backlash politics, so buy your kids gay books. Get on the board of your local library and make sure they don't burn books, because that's also not great. So I will leave it there and we will keep going. I think I saw a question in the chat, maybe?
No, I think just my reminder, I'd like to have as many faces on as possible. So I'm glad we have some. Thank you guys for joining. And I wanted to ask you, it seems like definitely a few of our programs, reach out to teens and people in their 20s who are getting into STEM. We'd love to have those contacts, those organizations and contacts, so we can invite them to the events that we run. That would be one way we can definitely help you. And then you have mentioned a lot of statistics, which I would love to kind of have in my back pocket just as information. If nothing else, I'm sure our team would also like to, if your website has all those, then happy to go there and look for those. But yeah, it's, there's every time we do these panel discussions, it's always very informational, educational for me. So
happy to do that.
Yeah.
Some of it's up on our website, some of it's other places. We always make sure that when we deal in stats, they are, cited somewhere real.
Yeah. That's a good good way to do business.
I will also say that the number on active duty service members is a bit speculative, because it will not surprise anyone here who's ever had to do a live survey. If you're gay and in the military and someone on the phone calls and asks you, the odds you actually want to answer candidly are low. So, shortly after the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, RAND was commissioned to do a study, and they guessed that, across active guard and reserve, there's about 2.5 million Americans. They guessed there were only 70,000 queer people in the entire US military. And that, based on what I've seen with my own eyes, either I've met all 70,000 of those people or they got the math wrong. And of course, this is a challenge where we are not quite all the way to being a protected civil rights class. And so a lot of the ways in which you could collect data and make presentations and then guide decisions and policy on it is a little bit more nebulous. Doesn't mean it's not impossible, but it is different.
Can I ask a totally irrelevant question about your background?
Sure, go for it.
Just, you were a speechwriter for several extremely important defense leaders. You can connect this to the topic or not, but I'm just curious about what was life like in that role as a speechwriter?
Oh, you bet. I would say as a gay guy, I had an advantage in the sense that, most queer people have to tell stories early and often to persuade people to either give a shit about them or not get killed, or both. I have a variety of learning disabilities, and while I have all these lovely books behind me, I also use a Kindle because it goes in dyslexic font, and then I can actually read without getting a blinding headache. So top line, my emotional intelligence was better than others people's. It also helped that, both of my parents have English PhDs, and so when I rolled in, I looked at the Pentagon and decided it was like being in a Jane Austen village, where instead of getting married at the end of the thing, you could get some policy reform or maybe a budget or some money programmed. And so I spent a lot of time rolling around the Pentagon, talking my way into card games or talking to people about their favorite book series, which if you're the US Navy is apparently the Aubrey Maturin series. So I had to go reread that. And in terms of supporting the secretaries, again, the great thing about being high emotional EQ is that you actually learn to chameleon around your bosses. And some of them are easier to deal with than others. Panetta, of course, was wildly funny and had come out of retirement. It was just a delight. And Chuck Hagel, of course, learned that I'd worked for Teddy Kennedy and glommed onto me. And when it came time to push Chuck Hagel along as the ex-Catholic Republican, I had a stack of Polaroids of different gay National Guardsmen from Nebraska. Just like, here's their hometown, here's their puppy, let's negotiate. It's a very human job. It's a very challenging job, especially at DoD. It's a great way to learn the building, though, because you go everywhere, talk to everyone, and get a lot of PowerPoint slides, as well as a lot of bizarre things sent to you on Zipper. But it's a great way to run the road. And I don't think I would be able to credibly create the organization without having had that stint, because as a result, I ended up being relatively high frequency, high touch with a lot of different senior national security officials who have one way or another pitched and helped out over the years, validating my theories of why ONS should exist, and then connecting, advocating, funding, that sort of thing.
I wanted to open it back up to our audience to see if you had other questions. We've covered a lot of ground here. I will
also take irreverent questions, guys.
Irreverent questions are welcome. Suzanne had a few, I know, earlier, so I'm not sure if we already covered all those.
We can go. Hold on, I'm just gonna.
Yeah, David, I'll go ahead and chime in. I know we had some people who joined late, and we welcome you. Please share any questions you have. So one that I am just fascinated by the statistics you shared today, and would love to hear what your analysis is of why so many people from the LGBTQ community are drawn to national service. What do you think explains that they outperform, straights in answering the call?
A couple of different things. So we know, at least with trans people, it is an attempt in many cases to reify the gender role you were born with as opposed to who you are authentically. Gay people, it just happens to be demographics of America. Like a lot of the people you run into happen to have grown up somewhere where it was a way out of their small town, and they happen to talk to a military recruiter. And so that is why there's a shift there. And we also tend to be better for some roles. I will also note that in the Navy, for example, there are more queer women than men, and more women are more able to explore a range of sexual orientation and identity as a function of being in a large women's group. So there's that. There's also just join the military to run from your sexual orientation, which was true in the bad old days when everyone had to be in the closet together. And now it's different, and things are fitfully getting better and occasionally getting worse. But there's no reason not to want to serve your country. Spencer, another question. Okay, top 3 priorities. So at macro, it is a mixture of getting the right folks into office. So currently negotiating about various cabinet officials. 2 is passing legislation. So I'm working with Representative Castro and Chris Murphy on that Love Act for the State Department, trying to get a similar bill passed for the Department of Energy with my pal Mike Quigley. And more importantly, it is going as far as we can in terms of building community and capacity in the event that the federal government and other things, the pendulum swings. We're trying to figure out all the different ways that we can insulate LGBT people in the national security state and increase standards. So for example, the IC's internal chat, their version of Slack is full of a bunch of vile, bigoted nonsense, including homophobic slurs. So that's something we want to crack down on. But primarily it's serving our constituents and making sure everyone's safe and stable. So I spend a fair amount of time on the phone listening to different military families and then different folks elsewhere, both at the State Department and at the Department of Defense. One of the problems for us is getting same-sex partners recognized under either status of forces agreements or the Vienna Convention so that people can go abroad as accredited spouses of US diplomats, which is a big hurdle to many people's careers.
Thanks, very clear. Appreciate it.
Sure.
I thought, just as an aside, I'm a big LinkedIn user, and I noticed a Marine officer and her spouse, who's a woman, kind of out together on a LinkedIn post a few weeks ago, and I was surprised. To be fair, she was in uniform. Her spouse was not, because she's not in uniform, and I was impressed by that. I think that's something that might humanize this topic to more people, is to know that it's these are people you might know, and they're doing their job, and just trying to live their life. And do you think that that's something else that people should take more risks doing? Meaning, if putting that out there in social media, is that too risky for most, or do you think it's a good idea so that it humanizes more people?
So I'll say a couple of things. I let everyone sort of decide their own risk and comfort level for any number of reasons. But we do run through our organization a sort of a public list of leaders and then younger folks. So we have one cluster that is folks over 30 and one that is folks under 27. And we tend to use that as a platform to recruit speakers, but also to drive visibility and combat homophobia in the field. It also then means that a lot of those folks get invited to do more stuff, both substantive to their area of expertise and in terms of being, a diverse person, an LGBTI speaker like I'm doing today. Some of that tends to go further, some of it less so. I will also say that, one of my good friends who I put on the list a couple of years ago was a submarine officer, and she recently took her wife to her first sub ball and made a similar LinkedIn post, but also talked about being at the sub ball and being, run down by two lesbian enlisted officers enlisted members who, had not been to a ball where someone had brought their same-sex partner before, and were so thrilled to see a lesbian officer. So it's clear that, the great thing is that we're everywhere, but we're also scattered. So each instance of visibility is really important. It's a question of what is high impact, but also, what each couple or what each professional is comfortable doing. Like, I do not care, and this is me all over the internet. I have a mentee who specializes in cybersecurity in the Middle East. And so he is very curtailed in terms of how much you can figure out he's a gay man on the internet for obvious reasons. As is true of a couple other friends of mine. I have a brilliant political science friend who's currently working on the Iran negotiations, who has a spouse who specializes in China. And because they've both gone back and forth to China and to Iran, they keep a low profile on the internet, things of that nature. But there's folks who can and do. And because we could be anyone, unlike sort of other minorities, it is a little bit trickier in terms of having a rule of thumb for everybody under the sun.
Thank you. Other questions from NSIN and our other colleagues?
I had a quick question, David.
Yeah.
So my interest was piqued, admittedly, Lucas, by your comment about the gays being against disco for that one time. That made me laugh, and I thought that was hilarious and thought it would be interesting. I was not familiar with the case that you were mentioning specifically. What resources you would recommend for people who need to be better allies?
Oh, that is a good question. First and foremost, I would go to GLAAD. GLAAD has a little bit of an education guide. And then Pride at Work has a great how to be an ally in a workspace guide. I will actually email these so that you guys can find them again later. Those are good places to start. Also, you can volunteer all sorts of different places. PFLAG is always a good place to be volunteer. They're always fun. I love them because right now in Texas, if your family is a PFLAG member, you are exempt from Texas's crazy laws about harming kids and having your kids kidnapped by Child Protective Services. So they're always a great first stop. But just be active and be gay friendly to all the gays in your life. And there's lots of opportunities. Just feel your way forward for what you've got time for. All those organizations that I mentioned that are a little bit more tech focused are always looking for folks who are professionals in the field who want to mentor or otherwise give back. So you can get a sort of a tighter match there to both your personal experience and then your expertise as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I got a question. As far as different career fields go, would you rank like government defense as one of the most difficult to be one's like authentic self in versus, I'm thinking about my brother. He's in the medical field.
Sure.
He's got no problems there. You know what I mean?
Right. Probably yes. Let's, broadly speaking, Department of Defense Uniformed Services. Hardest, though I will say the FBI is worse by orders of magnitude, as are sort of other arms of the intelligence community. So I know every single gay DEA agent that's plausibly out, because there's 12 of them and they fit in a broom closet still. DOD is, of course, a challenge because it places such a high value on conformity. And the end result, while not intended, is a lot of sort of, cutting yourself to fit into that. And you can think about all the way flag officers look more or less the same and have more or less the same pedigree, and why it's so hard to advance if you're a woman, person of color, woman of color, or a woman lesbian of color. I know a Marine flag, for example, who just retired and spent her entire career sort of being in a glass closet, so semi-visible, but not very, and is now definitely out of the closet. So it is, it is everything that is both good and bad about American society, but also the U.S. military has handicapped how it intakes, people who are not straight white men who look a certain way and think a certain way. And so, I will have discussions with the department about talent management, and they'll ask why there are not, more lesbians of color in their late 30s or early 40s who have had substantial Department of Defense experience. And so I'm like, let me tell you why. It's your own fault. And even beyond removing sort of formal barriers to entry, in that kind of environment, it is still not a great place to thrive if you're not like everybody else, which means, you have a wife who doesn't have a job, and you go to a certain kind of church, and they're all very nice. I am lucky in the sense that if you read my resume one way, I went to Wesleyan in Connecticut as an undergrad, and I went to Chicago for grad school. And so I sat down with the head of DIA, for example, before Michael Flynn was head of DIA. And we had a thrilling conversation because I had a U Chicago lanyard, and he informed me that his wife was the education correspondent for the magazine Newsmax, which is between Fox News and OAN in terms of its audience share. And he took University of Chicago to mean the very right-wing economics department. But I rolled through DOD and felt a lot of discomfort, but only because I'd grown up in America circa early 2000, where either at Wesleyan or anywhere else I'd worked, I was particularly uninteresting as a gay guy. And the Pentagon had still not caught up. And I think that's still going to be fits and starts for a long time, because it is not one throat to choke when it comes to culture and norms and behavior. It's thousands of them. And some of that stuff will change in time, and some of it will not change without a lot of sort of continuous pressure. State is better, of course, in lots of ways, but has its own weird foibles. And then sort of on downwards from there. Treasury, still sort of a mixed bag. The CIA tends to be the best, which is bizarre, but makes sense. They, like GCHQ, realized that in the 1970s, if you stopped making it a condition of revoking a clearance that you were gay, as long as you were open, they hired a bunch of gays. In fact, Angle is the longest running LGBT federal government or national security construed ERG. Angle's their gay group. And among sort of the senior leadership of the CIA, they like having and wearing the Angle lanyard and being supportive allies, which tells you a lot about institutional culture. Doesn't mean that's how you could fix the Department of Defense, because 23,000 people at the Pentagon plus a bunch more elsewhere are much harder to fix than the CIA's very small club. And also medicine and intelligence tend to pick up people with postgraduate degrees, so they are more likely to have met queer people earlier in their careers. I will say that, over the time that I was there, your flag officers and your colonels went from being people who had joined the US military back when Petticoat Junction was on the air to people who had seen the season of Real World with Francisco. And so it got incrementally less tedious. All right, there's another question, I think.
Yeah, Karen asked, what are some spaces? You had mentioned some places to help
Sure.
large, like GLAD and PFLAG.
Yeah.
I think Karen's asking inside of DoD.
Depending on where you are, there is a Pride organization. If you're in the building, there's DoD Pride, which is an affinity group. Go and ask them what they need. Their big prize event every year is an event on Pentagon grounds, one that just happened. But they'll be able to talk to you about sort of their mentor pipeline, that sort of thing. Obviously, also happy to talk to you in detail offline if you're not at DoD Maine, or if you're in one of the military service departments, things of that nature. Obviously, ask us, hire more gays, mentor more gays into the building. There are some of us there, but always room for more. And we can talk about how you can change, office culture in so much as you can ever change DoD office culture from what it is to something that's a little bit more inclusive and welcoming.
I wanted to point out your distinction. I think earlier you were talking about culture, and I definitely thought, I heard this from a senior executive the other day, actually, that we should distinguish between ethos and culture. And that ethos is what makes a military organization what makes it so good, right? Like, whether it's the Air Force or the Marine Corps, the way they fight, the way they collaborate, the way they work together. Certain things, if it's the Marine Corps, it's physical fitness is part of that, right? That's ethos. That can be valid still today. And this SES was saying that you should distinguish between that and culture, which should be yes, important, but up for debates, kind of a routinely up for debates thing, so that we can make improvements that make sense for the century we're in and for the kinds of people who we're trying to include, like you said, so we don't exclude people who might make the difference between a secure country and an insecure country. So what are your thoughts on that distinction between culture and ethos?
I mean, I think it's a good distinction. The question is, you can change policy and you can change law to some degree, but changing culture requires everyone to grab hands and jump off the roof together. And not everyone's going to want to do that. The other thing is that changing culture to be more inclusive, more open, works in sort of a colorblind way that may not actually have the intended outcome you want. Because you can say, we welcome everybody, but you also need to then think about, okay, if we now include these people, what does it mean in terms of how we provide? I mean, I talked through a bunch of different ways in which DoD benefits do not reflect. It's questions like, how do we provide childcare? What does our health insurance look like? What is our, telework policy? Things of that nature. But also, DoD is still really white and really male, and is all the workplace bonding poker games and drinking and sports outings, that sort of thing? Or are there other ways to build that esprit de corps? I happen to be apparently insufficiently threatening as a homosexual that I got invited to a bunch of poker games and played sports with people and talked my way through a bunch of things. And a lot of important work happens off the clock, even at DoD, even when you can't say classified things off the clock. And because, generally outgoing and genial, I was able to have strong relationships with members of the Joint Chiefs or service secretaries or whatever. And not everyone's going to necessarily be that inclined. And not every office is going to make people feel as welcome. And thus will either burn people out or drive them away because they can't see a way up and forward.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And just want to check in with our team to see if we had any more questions before we let Luke finish his day, and thank him for his time here. Any other questions?
Floor's open. I can say whatever.
I want to circle back to where you were talking about, not allowing treatment and those kinds of things. How do we help people understand the difference between being homosexual and gender identity? Because people don't get it. They assume if you identify as your non-cis self, that you are, you know, homosexual or whatever.
Yeah.
And I do work in the Episcopal Church in racial healing, reconciliation, LGBTQIA plus issues. And that is one of the things I get frustrated with people trying to explain to them, just because this cis person wants to be identified as something else does not make them homosexual.
Right. Yes. I mean, it depends on context, right? Obviously, negotiating in a church is different than negotiating in different parts of public life. And, you know, I will also say that I assume in the vast number of people sort of out there who are doing all sort of harmful backlash stuff are operating in bad faith. So generally don't argue with crazy or whatever. I mean, you know, one of my friends is a specialist in essentially moral panics as a field of academic expertise. And he just talks about how this is a classic version of that, and it's gross. But also that, like, in that context, there's people you can't persuade. When you want to persuade people, it's both harder and easier in the sense that, you know, being queer broadly construed, you know, not being straight when it comes to sexuality is different than gender identity, right? Because like one is who you are attracted to, whom you're going to form relationships, who you find attractive, and that can be, in my case, I'm a gay man. You can have lesbians, you can have pansexual people, you can have the whole spectrum as well as asexual folks. And gender identity is, you know, getting on the outside what you are on the inside, essentially. And it's, you know, the difference between gender and sex. And that's tough because not everyone will operate from a basis of those many different things are separate, as opposed to this is different than me, so it all must be the same weird thing I don't like. Which is one of those things I got to explain over and over again at DoD. And in the window between about 2015 and summer of 2016, when we ended the ban on trans-military service, I spent a lot of time playing a lot of poker with a lot of flashcards that explain the difference between a drag queen, a transvestite, and a transgender person. And I tell you, it was exhausting. It's exhausting to talk to a lot of colonels about this. But I will say, the boys in the Marine Corps that I worked out with at the Pentagon gym all followed Drag Race, and not only could tell me the difference between those three things, could tell me their favorite queens. So there's hope out there. But it requires immense patience to go case by case and to try to understand if that person is sincere, and also sort of what the time cost is for explaining first time, second time, third time. You know, just, you know, they can be trans and straight, or they can be, you know, trans and queer. Like I have friends who transitioned and, you know, they were assigned male at birth, became women, and by default became lesbians. Which is true in some cases, but not in all cases. I know a lot of trans men who functionally became gay when they transitioned, and only identified as that subsequently. And I have friends who transitioned and identify both as more complicatedly as bisexual. And so it's a question of how much empathy the other person has, and how much they are open to sort of a more complicated world. Because, you know, people, in my experience, having done reform politics for a long time, any given moment, a third of people will not care about what you're trying to do. They'll just be indifferent. A third will only be offended if they have to think about someone other than themselves, and it costs them more than a certain number of hours or minutes to understand. Then a sixth will always be unbelievably riled up about anything new and different because it's new and different, and they can activate about another sixth of any crowd of people to be a problem. Came by these numbers by doing things like allowing women to have combat roles and spending a lot of time talking to a lot of people and holding a lot of hands, because people will suddenly realize they did not get that far ahead in a meritocratic structure. They got far ahead because the playing field excluded most players. And rather than like taking that on and feeling something about it, they will decide that you're bad. And so it takes a lot of patience in situations like these to help people understand and to expand their world of who people are and be okay with it. And that's tough.
Luke, I just want to say thanks for a really informational, educational, and interesting hour. You know, if there was anything else you wanted to leave us with, I just wanted to give you that last comment, and also just thank our audience for attending.
Sure. Watch Heartstopper on Netflix. Let's go with that. That's perfectly banal. Obviously, you can find me on the internet. I tweet at out in NatSec, as well as at LFS Schleusener, my last name. Happy to take questions there. Happy to take questions also over email, which of course your leadership has. And I will be sending over those fact sheets and stats. It was a lot of fun to spend time with all of you as part of Pride, and I look forward to hearing from you next year.
Thanks so much. And for everyone online, just stay tuned for our next speaker events. That'll be later this summer. And Luke, thanks again for your time today, and everyone for attending.
Thanks so much, everyone. Enjoy yourselves.